Greetings and welcome. Tonight, we are plunging into the fascinating world of medieval vegetables. I can hear the collective groan. Thrilling? I know, but trust me, these are not your average root crops. Before we delve into the details, please take a quick moment to support the channel. Like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the historical journeys we take here. Also, drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always a pleasure seeing our global community gather. Now, perhaps dim the lights, switch on a fan for that ambient background hum, and let's gently ease into tonight's historical expedition. Our first subject is purslane, a plant that medieval authorities regarded with intense suspicion. Their distrust wasn't based on it being poisonous, riot-inducing, or dabbling in dark magic, but simply because it utterly refused to behave like a respectful, proper crop. It wouldn't line up neatly in ordered rows, it never waited for permission to grow, and it certainly didn't care which lord claimed ownership of the soil. Purslane simply appeared, often resembling an uninvited houseguest who also happened to be a superior chef. It flourished effortlessly during droughts, shrugged off the indignity of poor soil, and grew aggressively in the cracks between stones, along roadsides, in neglected courtyards, and sometimes in spots that made passers-by stop, stare at the ground, and question the laws of nature. How is that even possible? Medieval peasants rarely planted purslane. That would have required unnecessary exertion. Instead, they simply took note of its stubborn existence, realizing it hadn't perished despite all odds, and made the sensible, pragmatic choice to consume it. This singular act placed purslane miles ahead of the usual sluggish medieval decision-making curve. Nutritionally, purslane was almost rudely superior. Medieval nuns should not be reduced to mere symbols. They were real women operating within severely constrained choices, often placed into lifelong vows long before they possessed the maturity to fully comprehend them. Some adapted successfully, embracing their vocation with sincere faith. Others endured their struggle in silence. A notable few actively sought human connection wherever possible. By modern standards, their actions were neither unique nor shocking. What rendered them explosive was the unforgiving institutional system that encased them. The Church consistently framed forbidden relationships as profound moral failures, yet historical evidence points toward structural strain. Convents aggregated young people, eliminated personal choice, ruthlessly suppressed sexuality, enforced absolute silence, and demanded unattainable perfection. When cracks materialized, blame was systematically directed downward. Institutions guaranteed their own survival by absorbing collective guilt into individuals, who were then strategically erased from the official record. Ironically, the intense institutional effort invested in concealing these stories is precisely what guaranteed their eventual survival. Judicial records, reformed religious decrees, confiscated correspondence, and detailed disciplinary manuals preserved the very facts that sermons attempted to deny. Historians do not stumble upon these relationships by mere chance. They exist in the archives because the Church obsessively documented them in an effort to control what it realized it could not prevent. These persistent stories also explain why convents simultaneously fascinated and unsettled medieval society. They embodied an ideal of purity placed under extreme pressure and holiness constantly under surveillance. When these institutions failed, even subtly, it profoundly destabilized the broader cultural belief that strict rules possessed the power to fundamentally alter human nature. It contained an astonishing array of vitamins, minerals, and essential fats during an era when the average diet was composed mainly of dense bread, heavy regret, and whatever sustenance had been boiled into submission. It remained vividly green while more respectable vegetables wilted and collapsed under the slightest ecological pressure. It demanded no fertilizer, no complex irrigation, and certainly no motivational pep talks. Purslane simply persisted, a behavior that, within the rigidly controlled system of medieval agriculture, was deemed deeply suspicious. And this is where the conflict intensified. In the medieval mindset, food must originate in fields. Fields were surveyed, fields were taxed, and fields imposed obligations upon the tenant. Purslane bypassed this entire rigid structure. It transformed public roadsides into open pantries and humble walls into functioning grocery stores. No feudal lord designated its growth. No religious authority sanctioned it. No manor steward could possibly count the yield without crouching awkwardly in a corner, thereby silently conceding a total loss of control over the local food supply. Consequently, the authorities reacted as systems of power usually do when faced with something highly useful yet utterly inconvenient. They labeled it a weed. Weed is, in fact, not a botanical classification. It is an emotional and political declaration. It signifies, quite plainly, that this plant functions far too effectively and possesses an unacceptable disregard for imposed rules. Monastic gardens continued to cultivate purslane discreetly, largely because monks understood the value of food that didn't spontaneously perish out of protest. Medical treatises lauded its effects, and healers regularly incorporated it. However, the prospect of peasants freely accessing and consuming it was considered truly dangerous. A peasant independent of the central grain supply was a peasant immune to panic during shortages. The core problem was never desire itself, but the unrealistic belief that desire could be indefinitely sealed away. In subsequent centuries, reforms did succeed in mitigating some of the harshest extremes. Forced vocations decreased, and opportunities for education and genuine choice gradually improved. Nevertheless, the medieval experiment left an indelible mark. It starkly revealed the immense institutional cost of equating obedience with virtue in the absence of consent, and of mistaking enforced silence for true holiness. The physical walls of medieval convents were tangible. The vows undertaken were real. The expected standards were absolute. Yet, what was never real was the notion that human connection, affection, and intimacy could be permanently eradicated through the application of stone and rules. Behind every locked gate lived individuals actively navigating faith, fear, affection, and the persistent drive for survival. Forbidden relationships, therefore, were not the ultimate story of these convents. They were merely the most visible symptom. The true narrative is the painful consequence when powerful institutions demand perfection from inherently human beings, then relentlessly punish them for being exactly who they are. For a medieval convent, a religious vow transcended a personal spiritual commitment. It functioned as a formalized public contract, ritually spoken aloud, witnessed by church officials, meticulously recorded by scribes, and aggressively enforced by an institution that viewed these vows as indispensable structural pillars. When a nun violated a vow, particularly chastity, obedience, or enclosure, it was interpreted not as a passing moment of personal weakness, but as a direct institutional threat. The survival of the convent depended entirely upon its reputation. And history dictates that calm, non-panicked peasants inevitably create profound anxiety for those in power. Thus, purslane was never subjected to loud, public bans. Instead, it was aggressively ignored, deliberately erased from memory, and politely mocked. Why? Because attempting to eradicate a plant that sprouts ubiquitously is an exercise in futility. It is far simpler to convince the populace that the plant is fundamentally worthless. And purslane, tenacious and stubborn as ever, continued its quiet expansion, waiting patiently for the human world to finally acknowledge its critical, forgotten value. Salsify, by contrast, was never ostentatious. It didn't demand notice or grow in proud, visible abundance. If you judged salsify solely by its surface appearance, you would assume it was an agricultural failure. Above ground, salsify looked thin, unimpressive, and vaguely apologetic, resembling a plant that showed up to the medieval food system knowing full well it would never be taken seriously. Underground, however, salsify was quietly mastering the environment. Its long, sturdy root plunged deep into the soil, safely shielded from severe frost, punishing drought, hungry grazing animals, and the general unpredictable chaos of medieval farming. While other essential crops might panic at the first sign of inclement weather, salsify calmly continued its subterranean operations, efficiently collecting nutrients and patiently awaiting the arrival of someone intelligent enough to dig it up. Medieval peasants were quick to realize its worth. Salsify didn't require enriched soil. It didn't demand constant, draining attention. It certainly didn't suffer an emotional collapse during a cold snap. You planted it once and largely forgot about it, a feature that made it wildly efficient and deeply suspicious. Herein lay the problem. Medieval agricultural systems cherished visible exertion. Crucial donations, protection from local lords, and favor from the bishopric hinged on the perception that these houses were hermetically sealed spaces dedicated to discipline and purity. A single broken vow suggested that the protective walls had failed, the rules were ineffective, and institutional authority was rapidly eroding. Consequently, disciplinary actions were seldom quiet or merciful. Punishment was specifically engineered not just to correct the transgressing individual, but primarily to provide tangible reassurance to the wider community that institutional control remained absolute. Unlike secular justice, convent discipline operated without the checks and balances of juries, legal representation, or formal appeals. Abbesses wielded significant authority, and bishops possessed even greater power. Accusations required little proof beyond mere suspicion, pervasive rumor, or confessions extracted through intense psychological pressure. Once guilt was presumed, punishment was dispensed swiftly. The primary objectives were speed, containment, and setting a clear example. Even seemingly minor offenses were subject to escalation. Excessive displays of laughter, private unauthorized conversations, direct refusal to follow orders, or expressions of intense emotional attachment could all be interpreted as the early, dangerous signs of moral unraveling. The operational logic was strictly preventative. It was better to punish preemptively than risk the potential spread of corruption. A nun did not necessarily need to commit a grave scandal to face discipline. She merely needed to induce anxiety in her superiors. What rendered convent punishment exceptionally severe was its permanence. Secular sentences concluded. Fines were settled. Prison terms expired. Conversely, monastic discipline frequently recast the trajectory of an entire life. A woman who incurred official church punishment seldom recovered her former standing. They loved fields that could be easily inspected, precisely counted, reliably taxed, and openly admired by passing officials who desperately needed to feel productive. Salsify foiled this ambition by hiding. You couldn't readily assess the potential harvest. You couldn't easily determine who had plenty and who had none. Crucially, you couldn't panic the peasants by threatening their harvest when half of their food supply was literally underground, minding its own business. Even worse, Salsify offered exceptional nutrition, providing necessary carbohydrates, minerals, and ample sustenance to carry people through lean months without forcing them to beg for grain from centralized, controlled stores. This was a serious disruption to the established social blueprint. The accepted plan involved peasants being perpetually hungry, worried, and therefore emotionally pliable for obedience. Medical writers praised Salsify as strengthening and restorative, a description that should have been high praise, but instead merely amplified its suspicious reputation. Food that healed people reduced their dependence on costly remedies and charitable institutions, and medieval power structures were intensely invested in remaining indispensable. So Salsify gradually fell out of favor, not via outright bans or dramatic decrees, but through calculated neglect. It was labeled unfashionable, deemed old-fashioned, a reserve route for desperate times. It became something you only ate when better food wasn't available, a convenient narrative that discouraged anyone from admitting that it worked perfectly, consistently well. Above ground, Salsify remained humble and forgettable. Below ground, it fed people reliably through harsh winters and bad years. And like many efficient things in medieval history, it wasn't removed because it failed. It was removed because it succeeded too quietly to be controlled. Her reputation within the house was permanently scarred. Her activities were strictly constrained. Her future opportunities were drastically narrowed. The Church justified this system by framing it as spiritual medicine, asserting that pain was necessary to purge the soul and fear was essential to safeguard holiness. Yet, the systemic structure reveals a completely different function. Punishment served primarily as a tool of institutional maintenance. It meticulously preserved hierarchy, enforced silence, and demanded obedience in an environment largely devoid of individual consent. To violate a vow was to expose a potentially fatal crack in the system's foundation. Punishment existed explicitly to seal that fracture instantly, even if that meant psychologically crushing the individual who exposed it. In medieval convents, discipline was not fundamentally about forgiveness, it was about control, and that control was treated as sacred. When convent authorities sought to subdue a nun without attracting external scrutiny, they deployed the weapon of isolation. Solitary confinement stood as one of the most potent and frequently utilized penalties, specifically because it left no visible external marks. A nun could be systematically removed from the fabric of communal life, effectively erased, while physically remaining confined within the boundaries of the convent. Isolation cells varied widely in design, but virtually none were humane. They ranged from small chambers situated at the perimeter of the structure to repurposed storage rooms, and sometimes were little more than narrow, stone closets. Light access was minimal, and heating was consistently unreliable. In colder climates, winter confinement posed a serious physical danger. Often, the only provisions remaining were a thin straw mattress, a simple wooden stool, and a prayer book. Silence was ruthlessly enforced. Lovage was the medieval equivalent of that one friend who excels effortlessly at everything, and is therefore the object of deep-seated resentment. It functioned as a vegetable, a potent herb, and a robust medicine all at once, which immediately put it on thin ice with anyone who preferred clear categorical boundaries and tidy systems of control. Lovage simply refused to respect boundaries. It flavored mundane food, cured painful stomach problems, eased bodily discomfort, and grew back reliably year after year as if it had signed an ironclad, long-term lease with the earth. This was an enormous plant by herb standards. Tall, aggressively leafy, and confidently potent. You didn't need much of it because lovage was so concentrated. A little went a very long way, which immediately raised serious suspicions. Medieval systems preferred crops that required constant, grueling labor, meticulous oversight, and persistent reminders of who held ultimate authority. Lovage simply arrived and diligently performed its duty. Peasants adored it. It made bland food taste significantly less like a punishment. It aided digestion after meals consisting mostly of bread and sheer optimism. Crucially, it reduced reliance on apothecaries, traveling healers, and monastery medicine chests. Convenient for peasants, but awkward for the institutions that preferred to be the sole providers of relief. Medical texts openly celebrated lovage. It was recommended for bloating, pain, and general bodily distress, which, in the reality of medieval life, encompassed virtually everything. Monasteries cultivated it behind stone walls, where knowledge could be carefully curated and dispensed. But the idea of peasants growing lovage freely in their home gardens, that felt excessive, perhaps even dangerously empowering. Lovage also possessed the audacity to actively improve soil health. It attracted beneficial insects, offered cooling shade to the ground, and cooperated politely with neighboring plants. The disciplined nun was strictly forbidden to speak except during prayer, and in some severe cases even that was disallowed. Meals were slid through small apertures or simply left upon the cold floor. Confession, if permitted at all, was brief and tightly controlled. Human contact was reduced to the barest minimum, ensuring that the days blurred indistinguishably into one another. This meticulous isolation was entirely intentional. Medieval disciplinary philosophy viewed silence as both a form of penance and a mechanism for psychological pressure. The Church officially characterized solitude as spiritually purifying. Theoretically, alone with God, the sinner was meant to achieve deep reflection, repentance, and reform. In reality, the common effect was psychological collapse. Nuns accustomed to rigidly structured routines and shared worship suddenly faced total sensory emptiness. The deprived mind turned fiercely inward, and profound anxiety, despair, and even hallucinations became common occurrences, though official records rarely acknowledged them as such. Isolation also fulfilled a potent symbolic function. The sudden removal of a nun from communal spaces was a visible declaration of public disgrace. Her conspicuous absence served as a constant reminder to others that serious punishment was a tangible threat, even if the precise details of her offense remained undisclosed. Silence cultivated mystery, and mystery effectively amplified fear throughout the community. The duration of isolation was highly flexible. Some confinements lasted a few weeks, while others tragically extended into months or even years. Release was contingent upon subjective factors like perceived obedience, a satisfactory confession, or the arbitrary judgment of superiors. No standardized protocols existed. This fundamental uncertainty was deliberately integrated into the punishment itself. This was fundamentally opposed to the established agricultural model. Crops were meant to struggle. Struggle justified the entire feudal hierarchy. A plant that actively made life easier undermined the prevailing narrative. There was also the complicating factor of superstition. Lovage was traditionally associated with love, attraction, and emotional well-being, all concepts that medieval authorities found deeply unsettling. Anything that encouraged joy, comfort, or self-confidence among the peasantry was viewed with extreme suspicion. Happy people, after all, eventually ask inconvenient questions. So, lovage was not banned dramatically. No one marched into cottage gardens shouting decrees. Instead, it was gradually framed as excessive, overly old-fashioned, or exclusively medicinal rather than culinary. Something useful only in small, tightly supervised amounts. Peasants adapted, naturally. But over time, lovage slipped into the margins, vaguely remembered, used quietly, and eventually replaced by weaker, more manageable, and less self-sufficient alternatives. Not because lovage was inherently dangerous, but because it made the common people too comfortable. And comfort, historically speaking, has always made those in charge profoundly nervous. Skirt was sweet, remarkably starchy, and scandalously reliable, three traits that instantly placed it at odds with medieval agricultural expectations. It produced clusters of long, pale roots that tasted pleasantly sugary when cooked, making it suspiciously enjoyable. Food, according to medieval logic, was not supposed to be enjoyable unless you were either extremely wealthy or thoroughly inebriated. Skirt thrived in cold climates and tolerated wet soil, severe frost, and pure neglect with quiet, determined confidence. While other essential crops sulked and failed under the slightest inconvenience, Skirt kept expanding underground, as if it had accepted winter as a personal challenge. It didn't need rich land. Crucially, unlike secular imprisonment, solitary confinement within the convent had zero external oversight. No one inspected the conditions. No one monitored the physical or psychological damage. The abbess's authority was absolute within the enclosure. Thus, a punishment officially framed as spiritual guidance functioned, in practice, as an instrument of total, unchecked control. Isolation's primary achievement was not behavioral correction, but the total erasure of resistance. When a nun finally reappeared in communal life, she did so subdued, profoundly cautious, and intimately aware of her inherent vulnerability. Silence had effectively completed its punitive work. When silence proved insufficient, authorities deployed the next tool: hunger. The restriction of food constituted one of the most publicly visible and profoundly humiliating forms of discipline available in the medieval convent. It required neither shackles nor specialized cells, relying solely on the dining hall itself as the silent witness. A nun assigned a diet of bread and water literally wore her punishment on her body. This regime was precisely as austere as it sounded. Dry bread, frequently stale and coarse, and water, which was occasionally rationed, eliminating all vegetables, broth, and wine. The penalty could be imposed for days, weeks, or significantly longer, depending on the perceived gravity of the offense. In an era where daily meals were already inherently meager, this drastic reduction swiftly propelled the body toward. The purpose of enforced deprivation was not modern starvation, but total submission. This calculated weakness ensured compliance. Hunger served as an effective tool to sharpen obedience, leaving the weakened nun unable to resist, argue with, or defy the established authority. It didn't demand constant, visible care. It never panicked during bad years. It simply showed up when people needed it most. Naturally, peasants embraced it. Skirt reliably filled bellies during crucial grain shortages. It provided essential calories without requiring dependence on lord-controlled bread supplies. It grew successfully in places where wheat simply refused to cooperate. And worst of all, it required patience rather than constant labor. You planted it once and waited, a cycle which meant peasants weren't constantly visible, visibly sweating, and obediently toiling in the open fields. That last point was deeply troubling. Medieval systems favored crops that demanded endless attention. Attention kept the population busy. Busy people rarely organized, seldom complained, and had little time to notice that their landlord controlled most of the warmth and all of the firewood. Skirret radically disrupted that rhythm. It quietly promised food security without constant, overt suffering, which was, frankly, an unacceptable business model. Even elite households enjoyed skirret. It frequently appeared in noble kitchens, lauded for its sweetness and versatility. But once a food becomes equally popular among peasants and elites, it creates an uncomfortable social overlap, and medieval society was built entirely on strict separation. So, skirret began to be framed as old-fashioned, aggressively rural, and unsophisticated. Something you ate only when real food wasn't available, even though everyone privately knew it tasted excellent. This social downgrade made it much easier to abandon skirret without admitting the real reason. It worked too well. Over time, skirret was strategically replaced by crops that required more demanding labor, more expensive fertilizer, and far more centralized oversight. Crops that failed dramatically, thus ensuring the populace remained appropriately anxious. Skirret didn't disappear because it was weak. While the Church conveniently framed this diet as a pious imitation of Christ's suffering, a reminder of essential humility, in reality, it functioned as a form of physical coercion, cleverly disguised as rigorous spiritual exercise. This punishment was often enacted publicly. While her sisters enjoyed their communal meal, the disciplined nun was forced to sit apart or silently receive only her meager portion of bread. No verbal explanation was required. The community understood the implication instantly. Shame rather than pain did the decisive work. Hunger achieved isolation as effectively as physical confinement, yet without removing the body from view. The health consequences were serious, particularly for younger sisters or those already frail. Fainting spells, prolonged weakness, and severe dizziness were silently accepted risks. Disturbingly, complaints were never seen as distress but rather as renewed resistance, and a body that failed entirely was interpreted as damning evidence of guilt, not evidence of suffering endured. The bread and water diet was also used strategically as a tool of extraction. It frequently preceded formal confession, accompanied intense interrogation, or followed any suspected misconduct, even in the complete absence of proof. Hunger was known to soften resolve, encouraging a performance of repentance that the nun might otherwise have withheld. In this crucial sense, the diet became an instrument for extracting compliance as much as it was a means of punishment. Unlike voluntary secular fasting, convent hunger was strictly compulsory. Refusal to comply invariably escalated the disciplinary measures. There was no recourse, no negotiation, and absolutely no opportunity to appeal to family, secular law, or the wider community. Her very body was deemed the property of the rule. By maintaining absolute control over food, convent authorities effectively governed the nun's time, physical energy, and mental will. It disappeared because it was dependable, and in the medieval agricultural context, dependability in the wrong hands was considered a systemic threat. Good King Henry was not named after a generous monarch, despite the suggestions inherent in the name. There was no crown, no castle, and no tragic dynasty involved. It was named merely because medieval people had a common habit of calling highly useful things good, usually right before someone in authority decided they were profoundly inconvenient. And good King Henry was indeed very inconvenient. This substantial leafy green grew happily near human homes, along footpaths, beside manure piles, and in the kind of neglected soil that made other vegetables give up and immediately reconsider their life choices. It didn't need a formal field. It didn't require the investment of a plow. It never waited for official permission. Good King Henry followed people instead of respecting property lines, which immediately rendered it suspicious. Peasants treated it like a highly dependable neighbor. The leaves were consumed like spinach. The young shoots were cooked like delicate asparagus. The seeds could even be ground into a rudimentary flour during times of sheer desperation. One plant, multiple meals, minimal effort, medieval efficiency at its absolute finest. And, tragically, its downfall. Because here is the central issue. Food was required to come from land that could be measured, taxed, and held hostage via threat. Good King Henry grew profusely in liminal spaces, edges, corners, and forgotten patches of ground where the presence of centralized authority was weakest. You couldn't easily regulate its growth without attempting to regulate natural existence itself. It also thrived year after year. Once established, it returned reliably, offering food without requiring constant, exhausting labor, and medieval systems absolutely preferred constant labor. Labor justified the hierarchy. Hunger deliberately blurred clear thought, narrowed her focus entirely, and reduced her identity down to a single imperative, obedience. In medieval convents, true discipline did not require outright violence to achieve brutality. It only required patience, a calculated denial of food and water. When church authorities sought to make punishment a public demonstration, they utilized the ritual of public penance. Unlike the isolation of hunger or solitary confinement, this form of discipline relied entirely on visibility. Shame was never a mere side effect. It was the central objective. A nun condemned to public penance was required to perform humiliating acts of submission directly before her community. This might involve kneeling throughout services while others stood, lying prostrate on the cold stone floor, or confessing her transgression aloud in ambiguous yet unmistakable terms. On occasion, she was forced to wear special attire. Perhaps a coarse habit, the absence of her veil, or some other visible marker of disgrace that visually separated her from the rest of the convent. These highly charged rituals were meticulously choreographed, following a recognizable structure of public accusation, demonstrative submission, and, finally, conditional forgiveness. The community was compelled to watch in absolute silence. No comfort or support was permitted, as compassion risked being interpreted as an act of defiance against the superior. The message was unmistakable. Obedience could only be restored through utter public humiliation. This system powerfully reinforced the established hierarchy. The abbess or superior occupied the ultimate position of authority, dispensing mercy only after submission had been clearly and publicly demonstrated. Forgiveness was a gift granted from above, never something that could be negotiated from below. A plant that substantially reduced toil was practically an act of rebellion. To make matters worse, good King Henry possessed impressive medicinal uses. It soothed difficult digestion, eased inflammation, and generally helped people feel slightly less miserable. Plants that made life easier invariably attracted suspicion. Comfort, after all, leads to confidence, and confidence historically leads to truly inconvenient questions. So the solution wasn't a sudden, visible ban. That would have required significant effort. Instead, good King Henry was slowly and effectively rebranded as a weed. Something untidy, something uncivilized, something respectable people would never grow on purpose. Once officially labeled undesirable, it quietly vanished from managed, official gardens, even as it continued growing stubbornly wherever humans tried desperately to ignore it. Over time, newer crops replaced it. Crops that needed careful planting, fertilization, and constant oversight. Crops that failed spectacularly if neglected. Crops that clearly reminded people exactly how dependent they were. Good King Henry didn't fail. It was systematically dismissed. And like many things in medieval history, it didn't disappear because it was bad. It disappeared because it was too good at making life tolerable. Groundnut was the kind of crop that made medieval authorities deeply uneasy, primarily because it was far too clever for its own good. While respectable, compliant plants insisted on growing entirely above ground where every bushel could be seen and counted. Groundnut chose profound secrecy. It climbed politely like a vine on the surface, performing a modest impression, while simultaneously producing highly nutritious tubers underground. Hidden, securely protected, and absolutely none of anyone's official business. This self-sufficient plant thrived in poor soil, easily survived drought conditions, and shrugged off pests as if they were mild, passing inconveniences. Even when a nun had already endured periods of confinement or hunger, public penance served as the final, absolute confirmation that she had been successfully broken and fully reintegrated under the convent's control. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. Reputation was central to convent life, where communal existence depended on mutual trust, cooperation, and shared ritual observance. Public humiliation shattered that essential trust. The punished nun carried her disgrace long after the formal ritual concluded. Glances lingered, conversations abruptly ceased when she approached, and silence became her constant companion in the corridors. Theoretically, public penance was intended to cleanse both the sinner and the community itself. In practice, however, it primarily served to reinforce fear. Witnessing such punishment reminded every sister that her security and status relied entirely on unblemished compliance. Consequently, even innocent behavior became excessively cautious. Affection was carefully restrained, and speech became meticulously measured. The entire system policed itself through the persistent memory of what had been witnessed. Moreover, public penance was highly selective. Convents with strong connections sometimes minimized these rituals to avoid external scandal, and powerful families frequently negotiated discretion. Conversely, poorer nuns who lacked such political protection were far more likely to be made public examples. Justice, therefore, strictly followed social status. By transforming discipline into a sacred ritual, the Church effectively converted punishment into theater. The nun's body became the stage, shame served as the central lesson, and silence offered the cold applause. In medieval convents, public penance did more than simply correct the nun's individual behavior. It taught every person watching exactly how fragile their own place truly was. It didn't need fertilizer. It didn't demand complex irrigation. It didn't require constant, physical supervision, which meant that peasants could successfully grow it, harvest it, and eat it without ever asking for help or approval. This was already a major red flag. The tubers themselves were remarkably rich in both protein and calories, a dangerous combination when the overarching goal was maintaining population dependency. Grain shortages reliably caused panic. Ground nut mitigated panic. Reduced panic fostered calm thinking. And calm thinking consistently led to historically inconvenient outcomes. Even worse, ground nuts stored extremely well. It could be harvested discreetly and kept safely hidden underground until needed, meaning it was never visible during official inspections. Medieval officials loved crops they could clearly see. Seeing things made them experience a necessary sensation of control. Ground nut laughed quietly beneath the soil. Because the plant climbed rather than sprawled, it never looked impressive. No dramatic fields, no visible abundance. Just a modest vine doing its quiet thing while secretly feeding entire families through hard seasons. Authorities often dismissed it as insignificant, a perception that only aided its long-term survival. But that very invisibility was also its downfall. Crops that couldn't be easily counted couldn't be easily taxed. And anything that actively interfered with the machinery of taxation eventually acquired a terrible reputation. Ground nut became framed as unreliable, fundamentally wild, or unsuitable for proper, respectable farming, despite doing an excellent job for centuries. Over time, it was replaced by crops that were easier to monitor and much easier to fail. Crops that announced their suffering loudly when conditions weren't perfect. Crops that reminded peasants exactly how precarious and fragile their food supply was. Ground nut didn't disappear because it was weak. When convent authorities determined that a nun could no longer be trusted, yet could not be risked outside the cloister, they imposed one of the harshest available penalties: permanent enclosure. This punishment involved neither chains nor public spectacle. It was quieter, colder, and far more final. Permanent enclosure mandated that the nun remain inside the convent walls for the rest of her life, stripped of all privileges and freedom within the very space that was meant to offer refuge. Unlike ordinary cloistered life, this specialized enclosure was severely restrictive even by monastic standards. Her movements were curtailed, participation in communal activities was reduced or completely denied, and contact with others was rigidly controlled. Some women were permanently confined to specific wings of the building, forbidden to enter the choir, refectory, or garden at the same time as the general community. They prayed alone, they ate alone, and they worked alone. The physical convent remained around them, yet they ceased to be a functioning part of it. This was not exile but absolute containment. The institutional logic behind permanent enclosure was brutal in its simplicity. Expelling a nun risked external scandal, while releasing her into the secular world raised uncomfortable questions. Keeping her hidden, contained, and controlled solved both problems simultaneously. The institution's reputation remained intact, and the transgression effectively vanished from public view. For the punished nun, the effect was psychologically devastating. There was no established end date, no possibility of restoration to former status. Unlike temporary penance, permanent enclosure offered no hopeful narrative of redemption. It assumed the failure was irreversible. Her life narrowed tragically to a repetitive routine devoid of community, offering faith without fellowship. It disappeared because it was discreet, and in medieval systems of power, discretion was entirely unacceptable. Food was supposed to be visible, measurable, and conveniently vulnerable. Ground nut offered nourishment without spectacle. And that, historically, is how truly useful things quietly vanish. Sorrel was sharp, intensely sour, and unapologetically honest, which immediately made it a political problem. Its distinct lemony bite cut straight through the endless medieval diet of bland bread, watery porridge, and quiet despair. One taste and your entire mouth woke up. Your basic stew improved instantly, and for a brief moment you remembered that food could accomplish far more than merely keeping you biologically alive. Naturally, this novel idea was unsettling. Sorrel grew everywhere. In formal fields, lush meadows, woodland edges, and along roadsides. If the soil technically existed, Sorrel considered it a mere suggestion rather than a requirement. It thrived in poor conditions, survived harsh frost, and came back year after year with the confidence of a plant that knew no human could truly stop it. Medieval peasants adored it because it instantly made terrible food tolerable and bad food edible. It also accomplished something far more dangerous. It made spoiled food safer. Sorrel's natural acidity actively helped preserve meals and effectively mask unpleasant, risky flavors. When the meat was questionable, sorrel helped. When the milk was turning, sorrel helped. When sorrel offered immediate assistance, it drastically reduced household waste, minimized illness, and, critically, lessened the necessity of official food chains. This was, intentionally, not the desired outcome of the ruling class. Medieval medical manuscripts extolled sorrel for its cooling properties, its ability to mitigate fevers, and its aid in digestion. Simply put, it fostered a healthier peasantry. This extreme punishment was particularly common in cases involving repeated disobedience, sexual misconduct, or any accusation that seriously threatened the convent's reputation. Whether guilt was formally proven mattered less than the perceived risk. A woman deemed unstable, defiant, or dangerous to the established order could be quietly removed from sight forever. Church records seldom detail the emotional toll. They had no need to. Permanent enclosure achieved the one goal discipline sought above all others: absolute silence. The punished woman ceased to be an institutional problem because she ceased to be visible. Unlike secular imprisonment, permanent enclosure allowed for no legal challenge, no formal appeal, and no external oversight. Once imposed, reversal was virtually impossible. A nun might live decades under this sentence, aging behind the same protective walls that had betrayed her. In medieval convents, permanent enclosure was not correction. It was erasure, a life reduced to compliance, achieved not through physical violence, but through a calculated isolation so complete that all resistance simply ran out. Expulsion, in contrast, was the punishment reserved only for cases that the church could no longer contain quietly. Unlike enclosure, which hid failure, expulsion starkly exposed it. To be forcibly cast out of a convent was not merely the loss of a home, it represented a social death sentence. A nun expelled from her house instantly lost her spiritual protection, her identity, and her social status in one catastrophic moment. She was ritualistically stripped of her habit, sometimes publicly, sometimes behind closed doors, but always with profound symbolic effect. The habit was the physical marker of belonging. Without it, she became something dangerously ambiguous. A woman trained entirely for religious life, yet with no legitimate place in the secular world. For many women, expulsion was financially and socially catastrophic. Healthy peasants meant fewer demands for expensive remedies, fewer distracting pilgrimages, and fewer requirements for charitable aid. Any establishment naturally resists circumstances that render it redundant. Crucially, sorrel grew wild, eliminating the need for fields or official authorization to harvest it, a fact that constituted the true challenge. Foraging occupied a legally ambiguous space in the medieval world. It was grudgingly permitted during times of acute starvation, but aggressively suppressed when social control needed reinforcement. A plant that could nourish the populace without demanding rent or oversight ballooned that uncomfortable gray area. Consequently, sorrel developed an unfortunate reputation. It was declared too pungent, overly acidic, and excessively stimulating. Physicians of the era warned that consuming too much could destabilize the humors, a delightfully adaptable indictment applicable to any inconvenient truth. The narrative circulated that peasants who consumed sorrel in excess risked becoming volatile, perhaps even worse, developing independent opinions. Slowly, sorrel was nudged toward the periphery. It was never formally banned, but rather recast as something rustic, extreme, or strictly medicinal rather than an everyday foodstuff. It became a spice used sparingly, if at all, associated with periods of hardship rather than the rhythm of daily sustenance. Yet, sorrel persisted, clinging to hedgerows, creeping back into stew pots during lean seasons, serving as a quiet reminder that resilience, flavor, and survival often intertwine. Sorrel did not vanish because it was sharp. It disappeared because it made unacceptable living conditions slightly more bearable. And history seldom favors such mitigating influences. Cardon appeared to be a plant that had decisively lost a confrontation with societal standards yet resolved to flourish regardless. It was tall, fiercely spiky, and aggressively unwelcoming. Families who had placed daughters in convents often did so precisely because they could not support them, or did not wish to take them back. Dowries had been forfeited, making marriage impossible. An expelled nun returned to society burdened by intense suspicion, deep stigma, and few practical skills beyond basic prayer, reading, and domestic labor. Her survival depended precariously on charity or the highly selective mercy of relatives, who may have already written her off entirely. The Church did not resort to expulsion lightly. The perceived scandal had to substantially outweigh the risks of releasing her. Public sexual misconduct, persistent disobedience, or a refusal to submit to lesser discipline could push authorities to this ultimate extreme. Sometimes expulsion followed failed attempts at managing the nun through confinement or penance. Other times it was immediate, decisive, and unforgiving. Ironically, expulsion also functioned as a way to protect the integrity of the institution itself. Removing a problematic nun successfully shifted the blame entirely onto the individual. The convent could thus maintain its image of purity, and the overall system remained sound. The expelled woman became the singular story, distracting attention from the structural flaws that had shaped her transgression. Some expelled nuns vanished into abject poverty. Others attached themselves to informal religious communities, hospitals, or households willing to overlook their past disgrace. A very few managed to reinvent themselves entirely, but the historical record largely falls silent. Expulsion erased individuals from history just as effectively as enclosure erased them from immediate sight. Unlike secular punishment, there was no recognized path back, no rehabilitation, no restoration of status. Once expelled, a woman existed outside both church and society, belonging fully to neither. It resembled something installed to defend a fortified position rather than feed a household, an irony that perfectly explained its effectiveness. Though a relative of the artichoke, Cardon was significantly hardier and entirely uninterested in winning approval. It flourished in depleted soil, withstood severe drought, shrugged off pests, and ballooned into massive specimens that provided edible stalks and leaves for months on end. It demanded zero coddling, needed no costly fertilizer, and required no encouragement whatsoever. It simply expanded, occupying its space unapologetically, as if by permanent right. Peasants valued this immensely. Cardon delivered sustenance precisely when more conventional vegetables surrendered, particularly in arid zones where respectable crops failed almost instantly. It preserved well, cooked reliably, and nourished entire families with the barest minimum of labor. It was, in every meaningful way, inconveniently successful. Authorities, conversely, perceived a sign of disorder. Cardan defied neat cultivation. It disregarded property lines. It lacked any semblance of civilized appearance. The medieval agricultural paradigm favored plants that stayed rigidly in rows, behaved predictably, and visually affirmed that human ingenuity held mastery over nature. Cardan violated every rule. It looked feral, even when deliberately planted, a trait profoundly unnerving to anyone whose power rested on enforced structure. Its sheer size compounded the issue. Large plants implied peasant abundance, and abundance outside elite hands bred immediate discomfort. A wheat field could fail, dramatically reminding everyone who controlled the grain supply. A substantial patch of Cardan continued to provide food irrespective of weather fluctuations, which was perceived as utterly presumptuous. There was also the aesthetic objection. Medieval elites fetishized refinement, and Cardan was the antithesis of refinement. Expulsion starkly revealed the limits of medieval mercy. When discipline failed, compassion ended. The convent closed its doors and, with them, any moral obligation to the life it had helped to shape. When religious vows were broken, the resulting punishment was almost never shared equally. Discipline consistently followed the established hierarchy, and in that hierarchy, nuns nearly always bore a heavier burden than the men involved. If a relationship involved a priest, confessor, or other cleric, the consequences diverged sharply. Men were often simply reassigned, quietly transferred to a different parish or monastery, or subjected to mild penance that left their careers fundamentally intact. Their authority might be framed as temporarily compromised, but never their essential character. A simple change of location usually solved the institutional problem. Silence finished the job of protecting their future. Nuns were afforded no such convenient escape. Their bodies provided the irrefutable evidence. Pregnancy, damaged reputation, and forced confinement made their guilt glaringly visible in ways that male transgressions rarely were. Even when coercion was strongly suspected, the institutional responsibility inevitably fell downward. Church records speak far more often of fallen women than seduced nuns, a linguistic trick designed to erase the fundamental power imbalance while neatly preserving male authority. This imbalance was structural, not accidental. Clergy were institutional assets. They administered sacraments, maintained parishes, and upheld essential church operations. Nuns, by contrast, represented contained dependence. Their primary value resided in absolute obedience and invisibility. When conflict arose, the institutions predictably protected what they needed most to survive. Punishment also reflected prevailing assumptions about temptation. It required labor-intensive preparation, peeling, processing, patience, all skills readily available to the peasantry. It was far simpler to dismiss it as coarse and unpleasant than to acknowledge its unrivaled reliability. Thus, Cardan gradually faded from favor, not banned, but systematically ignored, replaced by varietals easier to manage, simpler to allow to fail, and more straightforward to justify restricting. Cardan transitioned into something eccentric, exotic, or simply forgotten, despite its history as a dietary mainstay. But Cardan never sought acceptance. It continued to grow wherever possible, spines bristling, leaves spread wide, a silent testament that true resilience demands no elegance. Cardan was not eradicated for being dangerous. It was removed for refusing to conform, and history has always preferred crops and people who willingly stay in line. Rampion was a specialist, adept at flourishing precisely where expectations were non-existent. Rocky ground, depleted earth, fields officially deemed worthless. Rampion viewed these conditions not as limitations, but as viable locations. While more fragile cultivars demanded rich soil and relentless attention, Rampion quietly took root in areas that medieval farmers had already discarded. Predictably, the peasantry took notice. Rampion yielded both edible roots and leaves, a suspiciously generous dual food source requiring minimal effort. In medieval agriculture, effortless bounty always raised supervisory alarms. Rampion neither required enrichment nor collapsed during inclement weather. It simply endured, feeding communities on neglected, marginal terrain where official interest and control were minimal. This inherent self-sufficiency was the critical obstacle. Rampion enabled sustenance on land that remained untaxed, unmonitored, or even unclaimed. It thrived on the literal and political edges. Church writers routinely portrayed women as morally weaker, more emotional, and inherently more susceptible to carnal desire. This deeply held belief justified demonstrably harsher discipline. If women were naturally unstable, the circular and devastating logic went, then strict, unforgiving control became mercy in disguise. Even within the convent walls, social class mattered profoundly. A nun from a noble family might secure a sentence of temporary confinement instead of permanent expulsion, as her powerful relatives could often intervene, negotiate, or apply significant pressure. Poor nuns lacked such vital shields. They were readily transformed into convenient examples of disorder, absorbing punishment intended primarily to reassure institutional authority. The injustice extended beyond the initial discipline into the historical memory itself. Men involved in scandals often vanished from church records, remaining unnamed and untraced. Women, however, remained documented in excruciating detail, their punishment meticulously preserved while the corresponding male responsibility faded into oblivion. History remembers this profound imbalance because the very system was designed to record it that way. Unequal punishment was not a flaw in convent discipline. It was one of its core, operational features. Control functioned optimally when fear was channeled strictly in one direction. By ensuring that nuns bore the full, isolating weight of transgression, the Church successfully maintained its hierarchy, protected its external reputation, and reinforced internalized obedience. In medieval convents, justice was far from blind. It knew exactly who it could afford to lose. One of the most striking aspects of convent punishment is how frequently its severity exceeded that of contemporary secular justice. Outside the cloister, even serious offenses were governed by defined laws, time limits, and, in some cases, the possibility of negotiation or pardon. When communities could sustain themselves on forgotten slopes, the entire foundation of centralized food control began to appear optional. Furthermore, Rampion required patience more than ceaseless, backbreaking labor. You planted it, allowed time, and harvested when ready. This reduced the time peasants spent constantly visible in the fields under the watchful gaze of overseers. Medieval social structure valued visibility. If people were not constantly in sight, they might be contemplating, and historically, contemplation has a troubling tendency to precede dissent. There was also the baggage of symbolism. Rampion quickly became tied to rural autonomy and entrenched folk culture, celebrated in regional dishes, stories, and songs. Anything fostering a strong identity outside the centralized hierarchy was met with cautious alarm, as cultural confidence often serves as the entry point for inconvenient questions. Rampion was thus subtly redefined. It became coarse, hopelessly rustic, and eventually archaic. Newer crops promised higher yields but demanded correspondingly higher dependency. Rampion was gently sidelined, not because it failed nutritionally, but because it didn't fit the mandated narrative of agricultural progress. Later folklore would often feature Rampion in cautionary fairy tales. Eat the Rampion, and retribution follows. A plant that previously fed the hungry was masterfully transformed into a cautionary tale about respecting one's allotted social standing. The strategy was subtle, the effect profound. Rampion retreated from tables and fields, replaced by varietals demanding richer earth, superior tools, and greater oversight. Crops designed to perpetually remind people who held the reins of survival. Yet Rampion persists in forgotten corners, just as always, waiting, flourishing, and entirely unimpressed by history's verdict. Rampion did not vanish due to weakness. It disappeared because it rendered marginal land valuable. Inside the convent, discipline was indefinite, absolute, and entirely insulated from external scrutiny. A woman accused in a town court could appeal to family, local custom, or even attempt to flee. A nun could do none of these things. Once enclosed, She lived under a parallel legal system where abbesses and bishops functioned as the judge, jury, and executioner of her social life. Punishment was not measured in fines or fixed days, but in the abstract requirements of obedience and submission, concepts with no clear, quantifiable endpoint. Secular prisons were understood clearly as punitive institutions. Convent discipline, by contrast, was framed deceptively as correction, often described as spiritual medicine. This key distinction mattered immensely, as there was consequently no institutional obligation to limit either its duration or its severity. If suffering continued, it was simply interpreted as necessary spiritual work. If the nun broke under the pressure, that was deemed proof of her innate guilt, not evidence of excessive treatment. In some severe cases, secular law would have proved the more merciful path. A woman accused of sexual misconduct outside a convent might face public shaming or a fine, but she retained mobility and the possibility of eventually rebuilding her life. A nun faced lifelong enclosure, irreversible erasure, or total abandonment. The Church punished not just the offending act, but the entire identity of the woman. This intrinsic harshness was entirely intentional. Convents relied heavily on rigorous discipline to maintain the illusion of sanctity. If vows could be broken without devastating, life-altering consequences, the entire system would fracture. Severity thus preserved fear, and fear ultimately preserved order. And that prospect has always been profoundly uncomfortable for systems predicated on engineered scarcity. Alexander's roots were once ubiquitous, which explains precisely why they are now largely unknown. Before carrots confidently colonized medieval kitchens and marched into modern grocery stores, Alexander's roots performed the same function, but with less fuss and greater intrinsic competence. This plant thrived in nutrient-poor ground, easily withstood the cold, and demanded virtually no management. Its roots were nutritious, its leaves practical, and it possessed an irritating willingness to establish itself anywhere agricultural complexity was ignored. In short, it worked too well. Alexander's roots were standard fare in monastery plots, village gardens, and along rough roadsides. They fed people dependably without requiring endless input, which presented an inherent administrative challenge. Crops that behave too well diminish urgency, and urgency serves as the crucial underpinning of centralized control. Carrots, in stark contrast, were far more demanding and visible. They necessitated richer earth, higher maintenance, and dedicated attention. They also responded remarkably well to selective breeding, allowing authorities to standardize the variety, control the supply of seed stock, and precisely quantify yields. Alexander's roots flatly refused to participate in this controlled vision. They resisted standardization. They declined to improve on command. They simply remained consistently useful. Naturally, usefulness divorced from obedience was deemed intolerable. Alexander's roots also suffered from poor status signaling. They were perceived as ancient, familiar, and intrinsically linked to the simple countryside rather than forward motion. As carrots gained cultural cachet, Alexander's roots were repositioned as passé, something your elders consumed when times were grim. Ironically, the Church's insistence on strictly internal discipline sometimes shielded nuns from the worst of secular violence. She avoided public execution or outright corporal punishment, but this came at the ultimate cost of freedom. She submitted to a quieter, more protracted suffering behind cloister walls. Mercy and cruelty were inextricably entangled in this process. The complete absence of external oversight made systemic abuse remarkably easy. Inspections focused solely on obedience, never on the well-being of the sisters. Complaints were uniformly treated as evidence of defiance, and appeals simply vanished into the rigid hierarchy. Discipline thus became tragically self-justifying. Compared to the secular legal system, convent punishment was invisible, indefinite, and utterly unchallengeable. It left no public record of cruelty, only the resulting obedient silence. And in many ways, that silence made it far more effective. The cloister promised protection from the dangers of the world. For punished nuns, it delivered something else entirely: a justice system with no exit. At the terminus of every single punishment stood the same, unspoken goal: fear. Medieval convent discipline was never designed to foster genuine moral insight or spiritual healing. It was engineered specifically to prevent repetition. Fear, meticulously cultivated, proved far more reliable than faith alone. Each measure, be it isolation, hunger, public humiliation, permanent enclosure, or expulsion, served a vital dual purpose, correcting the individual while simultaneously educating the entire community. Nuns learned not only what was forbidden, but precisely what awaited them if they dared to cross invisible institutional boundaries. While the painful details were rarely discussed openly, the consequences were thoroughly understood through absence, enforced silence, and whispered knowledge. This pervasive fear reshaped behavior long before any vow was broken. No official decree was needed. Social pressure executed the work efficiently and quietly. Although medical texts continued to laud Alexander's roots for their digestive and nourishing qualities, culinary trends progressed. Once a food loses its fashionable appeal, it quickly becomes expendable. History possesses a remarkable talent for erasing anything that fails to market itself effectively. Inevitably, Alexander's roots were supplanted by crops that looked brighter, grew cleaner, and were inherently more manageable, plants that aligned neatly with economic forecasts and physical rows, crops that could fail conspicuously when the system needed to enforce submission. Alexander's roots did not fail. They were replaced. And in historical terms, replacement is frequently the euphemistic version of eradication. Today, Alexander's roots survive mostly as scholarly footnotes, silent reminders that durability seldom triumphs over aesthetics, and that the most self-sufficient plants are often the first to be consigned to oblivion. Borage was the type of plant that delivered an excessive suite of benefits while demanding minimal reciprocation. It healed physical ailments, elevated moods, attracted vital pollinators, enriched the earth, and gently reseeded itself without the need for micromanagement. In the hierarchical context of medieval agriculture, such profound cooperation was viewed with deep suspicion. Borage established itself quickly and happily in depleted soil. It never withered during dry spells, nor did it sulk during cold snaps. It produced edible flowers and leaves while subtly bolstering the vitality of adjacent crops. Farmers observed that fields containing borage appeared healthier, yielded more, and were oddly less afflicted by agricultural drama, a deviation from the expected medieval farming experience. Medical practitioners adored borage. It was celebrated for its capacity to fortify the heart, soothe the nervous spirit, and even foster courage. It drastically limited friendships, moderated all forms of speech, and actively discouraged emotional attachment. Nuns learned to meticulously regulate themselves, not necessarily because they fully agreed with the rule, but because deviation represented clear and present danger. Discipline achieved its greatest success when it no longer needed to be applied. This established system preserved institutional stability by making punishment severe and often unpredictable, ensuring that authority remained fundamentally unquestioned. The abbess had no need to issue overt threats. Her power was already deeply internalized. Obedience became instinctive. The tragedy of the system is that fear inevitably outlived any specific guilt. Even nuns who faithfully kept their vows lived under constant, internalized self-surveillance. Joy became suspicious, affection was deemed risky, and silence became the only true safety. The convent successfully produced compliance, not through holiness, but through relentless anxiety. Church writers celebrated this result as divinely inspired order. Modern historians recognize it as absolute control. The human cost left no physical scars that could be inspected, and fear left behind no documents. It existed only in observed behavior. Punishment in medieval convents was not exceptional. It was foundational. It shaped daily life, dictated relationships, and defined identity. The threat of punishment mattered far more than the act of transgression itself. Most nuns obeyed not because they were saints, but because they understood the devastating alternative. In the end, convent discipline reveals an uncomfortable truth. Institutions that demand human perfection often rely heavily on the sustained application of fear. The walls held, and the rules endured, but what they ultimately protected was not purity alone. It was an authority structure maintained by the quiet, chilling understanding that breaking a vow could indeed cost everything. A grand claim, perhaps, but medieval medicine rarely lacked optimism. Borage teas, poultices, and infusions directly reduced the populace's reliance on costly professional remedies, which again generated institutional disquiet. If people could self-medicate, what function remained for everyone else? Borage also naturally attracted beneficial insects and bees, effortlessly boosting pollination. It achieved what modern agriculture attempts to replicate through entire, expensive industries and did so for free. That degree of uncompensated efficiency tends to render administrative structures anxious. Compounding this was the cultural implication. Borage became intrinsically linked to emotional equilibrium. It was popularly believed to dispel melancholy and encourage contentment. Medieval authorities could manage and tolerate sadness. Sadness was a predictable state. Happiness, however, created a relaxed populace. Relaxed people had the leisure to pose inquiries. Consequently, borage was gently marginalized. It was not outlawed, but strategically repositioned as ornamental, purely medicinal, or simply optional, a pleasant addition but never critical. Once a plant is officially deemed non-essential, its disappearance is assured. As agricultural focus shifted toward crops demanding continuous oversight, prescribed rotation, and purchased fertilizers, borage quietly evaporated from the core of the food system. It survived in personal gardens, on field margins, and in memory, but never in a place where it could exert meaningful systemic influence. Yet borage never ceased its work. It still grows readily, sustains insects, and revitalizes soil, eternally reminding us that cooperation with the natural world is not only achievable, but profoundly inconvenient for systems built upon struggle. Borage did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because it solved problems too seamlessly. And history seldom memorializes seamless solutions. In the ancient world, love was rarely treated as something soft or sentimental. Instead, it was understood as a volatile force capable of disrupting households, bending reason, and ruining carefully arranged lives. Desire was not romanticized as destiny. It was deeply feared as chaos. Ancient people did not ask whether love was beautiful. They urgently asked how to survive it, control it, or potentially weaponize it. Greek and Roman writers routinely described love as an insidious illness that entered the body without seeking permission. Plato famously compared it to a temporary state of madness. Physicians even codified lovesickness, eros or melancholia amatoria, as a genuine medical condition, complete with debilitating symptoms. Insomnia, profound loss of appetite, consuming obsession, physical trembling, and melancholy. If love possessed the power to make the body truly sick, then it. Ancient aphrodisiacs were far from neutral instruments. They were deeply embedded in the prevailing systems of power, status, and social inequality, meaning the inherent risks associated with their use were almost never distributed fairly. While the urge of desire was universal, the consequences of acting upon it were highly stratified. For men of the elite class, these substances functioned primarily as indulgences. A botched attempt at seduction or a failed potion usually resulted in nothing more than social embarrassment, a minor waste of funds, or perhaps mockery in the circulating satires of the day. Conversely, for women, enslaved individuals, and others lacking social or legal protection, the stakes were catastrophically high. An accusation of employing love magic could instantly ruin a reputation, expose them to severe legal penalties, or even provide justification for outright violence. The exact same behavior, interpreted as frivolous excess when practiced by a privileged man, was immediately recast as dangerous and illicit manipulation when linked to the vulnerable. Mallow functioned as the medieval equivalent of that one neighbor who navigates every calamity. Famine, plague, crop eradication, with an untroubled expression and a steaming pot of nourishing soup. It thrived universally, offered assistance for nearly every minor complaint, and demanded nothing in exchange, rendering it instantly suspicious. Mallow flourished in poor soils, alongside paths, near dwellings, and in abandoned plots where more demanding crops flatly refused to cooperate. Its leaves, roots, and flowers were all edible. This versatility alone was deemed excessive. Medieval food supply preferred sharp specialization. One plant, one defined use, one neat taxation category. Mallow disregarded these boundaries, reliably feeding people in multiple ways simultaneously. It was also powerfully medicinal, a trait that further diminished its status. Mallow eased sore throats, mitigated digestive distress, calmed inflammation, and generally lessened the number of reasons ordinary people needed to consult official, costly healers. A single plant that blurred the lines between subsistence and remedy-challenged definitions that authorities preferred to maintain rigidly separate. Worse still, mallow was intrinsically soothing. Its gentle, mucilaginous texture softened rough stews, thickened thin broths, and elevated otherwise bleak meals into something that felt intentional. Comfort is inherently dangerous. Comfort cultivates stability. Stable communities do not succumb to administrative panic readily. Mallow proved especially vital during difficult years. When official grain reserves dwindled and farmed land failed, mallow appeared irrespective of circumstances, quietly bridging the nutritional deficit. It transformed forgotten patches of earth into spontaneous emergency rations. From an administrative perspective, this was ruinous. Hunger was intended as a leverage point, a lever of control. Mallow systematically relieved that systemic pressure. Women were particularly targeted in hostile literary sources, frequently depicted by male writers as secretive potion brewers who corrupted men using unnatural, magical means. This dominant narrative was rooted more in male societal anxiety than in actual widespread practice. Since women often possessed limited legitimate avenues to pursue genuine desire, reject unwanted advances, or navigate the constraints of arranged marriages, aphrodisiacs and love magic represented a strategic, though perilous, source of leverage in a world structurally biased against their agency. Enslaved people existed in the most precarious position imaginable. Their physical persons were owned and controlled by others, yet they were often held responsible for the very desire their masters directed toward them. In surviving records, aphrodisiacs functioned both as risky tools for survival, used to secure favor or minimal protection, and as instruments of accusation, where an enslaved person was unjustly blamed for seduction to justify brutal punishment. For them, desire itself became an unavoidable liability. Furthermore, the structure of power fundamentally negated the concept of consent. Many aphrodisiacs were administered surreptitiously, mixed into wine, food, or scented oils, thereby completely blurring the ethical boundary between genuine attraction and forced coercion. This clandestine administration was rarely interrogated by ancient society. The effect of induced desire was prioritized over the recipient's agreement. Success was judged solely by the outcome, not by any ethical standard. This profound power imbalance clarifies why aphrodisiacs were simultaneously so popular and so deeply feared. They posed a latent threat to social order by offering a backdoor bypass around rigid hierarchy. If powerful desire could be manufactured chemically or magically, the established controls of class, gender, and authority momentarily dissolved. Consequently, mallow was simply branded a weed, an unremarkable, common, boring plant unworthy of serious consideration. This marginalization was strategic. Labeling something common is an exceptionally effective means of removing it from critical discussion without ever having to justify the removal. Though medical writers continued to endorse mallow quietly, official agriculture pivoted toward crops that demanded intensified labor, complex planning, and meticulous oversight. Crops designed to fail spectacularly when neglected, thereby constantly reaffirming the supposed fragility of existence. Mallow naturally persisted. It always does. It retreats to the margins, appears reliably during periods of stress, and recedes when centralized systems regain momentum. It neither protests nor argues. It merely waits. Mallow did not disappear because it was weak. It vanished because it was forgiving. And forgiving solutions perpetually risk undermining strictly imposed systems. Sea kale deliberately selected locations that medieval agriculture politely pretended did not exist. Wind-battered shores, pebbled coastlines, and saline soils that mocked conventional crops were its preferred domains. Where wheat failed instantly and barley surrendered out of sheer resentment, sea kale stood resilient, boasting thick leaves and deep root systems, entirely unfazed by environmental conditions that would induce an existential collapse in other vegetables. It required no proprietary fertilizer. It shrugged off salt spray, It survived storms, prolonged drought, and total neglect. In essence, it absolutely refused to participate in the dramatic struggle necessary to render farming controllable. Coastal populations depended heavily upon sea kale. It furnished fresh greens when inland cultivation collapsed, and it returned reliably year after year without complaint. There was no plowing necessary, no field rotation mandated, and no supplicating the heavens for favorable weather. This perceived ability to subvert traditional structures made these preparations feel inherently dangerous, even in contexts where their use was widespread. Although various laws sporadically targeted love magic, enforcement remained highly inconsistent. Punishment tended to follow public scandal or political convenience rather than ethical principle. In every instance, status remained the final determinant of the outcome. Those with social power were able to effectively absorb the inherent risks. Ultimately, aphrodisiacs expose an uncomfortable truth about love in antiquity. Desire was never merely personal. It was fundamentally political. The very tools intended to kindle passion revealed precisely who possessed the privilege to desire freely, and who was forced to pay the steep, often devastating consequences afterward. Not everyone in antiquity believed in. The pursuit of aphrodisiacs was never without question. Running parallel to the ancient traditions of recipes and elaborate rituals was a deep vein of doubt, pervasive mockery, and quiet, persistent skepticism. Distinguished philosophers, practicing physicians, and scathing satirists often dismissed these love potions not as symbols of true power, but as pathetic signs of desperation. Greek thinkers, notably Hippocrates, and subsequent generations of medical writers cautioned that the efficacy of many supposed aphrodisiacs stemmed less from chemical reactions and more from suggestion. If a hopeful lover genuinely believed a concoction would ignite passion, the body was frequently known to respond accordingly. This powerful psychosomatic effect did not render the outcome meaningless. Rather, it fundamentally shifted the responsibility for the change from the inert ingredient to the dynamic power of the mind. In this nuanced view, desire was inherently psychological before manifesting as physical. Roman satirists seized upon this psychological vulnerability with relish. One simply harvested and proceeded with life, which constituted the precise problem. Sea kale entirely circumvented the established inland food hierarchy. It grew outside managed fields, beyond simple taxation, and far removed from routine oversight. Landed gentry controlled the arable fields, the barns, and the grain stocks. They did not, however, control the beaches. Anything that nourished the populace outside official systemic bounds was viewed as inherently, suspiciously convenient. There was also the issue of durability and structural strength. Sea kale was rugged. Its tough foliage resisted pests and decay. Its roots anchored it so firmly that coastal storms often failed to dislodge it. Resilience of this magnitude directly challenged the prevailing medieval doctrine that nature required constant, forceful domination. Sea kale did not seek domination. It sought space. Authorities avoided outright prohibition, which would have inadvertently acknowledged its worth. Instead, it was framed as inherently wild, coarse, and inferior to proper vegetables, something consumed by shore dwellers because no better alternative existed. This narrative proved quietly, devastatingly effective. As centrally managed inland agriculture expanded and commercial trade networks matured, sea kale was superseded by varietals that were easier to standardize, transportable, and more compliant with market demands. These were crops fundamentally reliant on infrastructure, and thus destined to fail when those systems failed. Sea kale asked only to be left undisturbed. Over centuries, it retreated to the fringes, the dunes, the cliffs, the neglected littoral zone. Still growing, still edible, still performing precisely as it always had. It did not vanish. It was merely disregarded until it achieved invisibility. Sea kale did not disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it grew beyond the reach of institutional authority. The spectacle of wealthy, aging men desperately chasing virility through expensive oysters, rare wines, and dubious exotic powders became a stock character in their theatrical repertoire. They were relentlessly mocked as ridiculous figures, pathetic symbols of a fear of decline. For them, aphrodisiacs represented deep-seated insecurity rather than genuine potency. The humor landed because the audience instantly recognized the pervasive behavior being lampooned. Simultaneously, some physicians openly cautioned the public against relying on extreme or hazardous remedies. Potent substances, such as mandrake or various bull derivatives, were explicitly acknowledged as inherently dangerous. To pursue love by chemically poisoning the body was characterized as foolish and destructive, never heroic. They warned that excessive stimulation compromised overall health, dulled rational reason, and invariably led to compulsive obsession rather than true satisfaction. Yet, this widespread skepticism never managed to extinguish the practice entirely. Rather, it merely coexisted with persistent belief. Even those who harbored deep doubts about the chemical strength of specific ingredients readily accepted the underlying social logic. Mood mattered, environment mattered, and expectations certainly mattered. A prepared potion might be a chemical failure but a social success, effectively signaling intent, seriousness, or profound effort. This enduring tension reveals a crucial insight into human nature. Aphrodisiacs, fundamentally, did not require consistent effectiveness to maintain their popularity. They only needed to offer hope. In an ancient world where romantic success was uncertain and public rejection deeply costly, any alleged tool that promised even a marginal advantage retained extraordinary cultural value. Satire, ironically, also served a protective social function. And history has always struggled to account for things that flourish outside its control. The asparagus pea possessed a deeply confusing identity, a trait that did little to ensure its long-term survival. It was neither truly asparagus nor strictly a pea. It offered a hint of asparagus flavor when juvenile, developed edible pods later in the season, and generally declined to be pigeonholed into a single, predictable role. Medieval agricultural practice prized absolute clarity. The asparagus pea, conversely, offered versatility, a trait that made administrators nervous. This resilient plant flourished in inferior soil, was highly heat-tolerant, resisted common pests, and required only minimal cultivation. It grew contentedly where other vegetables languished, providing both edible shoots and pods across an extended harvest season. To summarize, it delivered an excessive quantity of value while requesting far too little effort in return. This tension between holy expectation and the stubborn human reality inevitably set the scene for the compromises that followed. Forbidden relationships did not erupt because convents were inherently immoral spaces. They occurred because these were fundamentally human environments constructed around an ideal that steadfastly ignored how deep and persistent desire can be when confined behind stone walls. When outside contact was strictly limited, emotion had a natural tendency to fold back upon itself. Medieval convents were overwhelmingly female spheres where women ate, worked, and slept under the same roof, sharing their lives with almost no reprieve. In this context, intimacy was not optional. It was unavoidable. The Church actively encouraged spiritual sisterhood, yet rarely paused to define the precise boundary where spiritual closeness ended and something else, something quietly troubling, began. Friendships between nuns could become profoundly intense. By laughing publicly at the pursuit of aphrodisiacs, elite men could distance themselves from the painful vulnerability inherent in desire itself. Mockery transformed deep anxiety into permissible humor. If love and lust could be lightly joked about, they felt less inherently dangerous. This luxury of skepticism, however, rarely extended to women or those occupying marginalized social positions. Doubt, in essence, was a privilege reserved for the powerful. Those who held sway could comfortably dismiss aphrodisiacs as mere foolish nonsense. Those without power often relied on them as a desperate strategy. Ultimately, antiquity grasped a profound paradox that remains true today. Desire can never be fully controlled, but it can absolutely be influenced. Aphrodisiacs thus occupied the fluid boundary between desperate hope and profound delusion, simultaneously mocked and implicitly trusted, and that inherent contradiction was more than enough to ensure their longevity. When the historical dust settles, ancient aphrodisiacs reveal substantially less about physiological chemistry and far more about human fear. Mandrake root, bull's blood, coveted oysters, and whispered incantations were not merely tools for seduction. They were tangible responses to a world where romantic love was highly risky, social reputation was fragile, and personal choice was often severely limited. Aphrodisiacs offered the promise of control in unstable situations where genuine control seldom existed. They provided a necessary course of action when raw honesty was dangerous, consent remained nebulous, and outright rejection was prohibitively costly. Whether the ingredients chemically worked became secondary to what they represented. Deliberate intervention instead of passive helplessness, action taken instead of endless waiting. Ancient societies generally did not view love as spontaneous and pure. They understood it as inherently disruptive and dangerous. Letters and monastic rulebooks speak worriedly of particular friendships, a phrase church officials employed when concern edged into their tone. These were hardly casual bonds. Some pairs insisted on sitting, working, and praying side by side, becoming visibly distressed when forced to separate. Abbesses were specifically warned to dismantle such attachments, not merely because they undermined discipline, but because they were believed to lead the heart dangerously astray. Church writers struggled to articulate the full scope of their fear without admitting it outright, issuing warnings against excessive physical touching, sharing beds, engaging in whispered conversations after lights out, and exchanging secret gifts. The repeated presence of these prohibitions confirms they were not based on imaginary fears. Where rules appear repeatedly, behavior is endemic. In convents, where genuine warmth and open affection were scarce commodities, emotional hunger found willing and available partners. While not all intimacy was sexual, medieval authorities consistently assumed that it could swiftly become so. Emotional bonds were viewed as dangerous precisely because they felt so harmless initially. Comfort shared during illness quickly morphed into dependency. Shared grief solidified into exclusivity. In a world that utterly denied romantic attachment, even the smallest gestures carried enormous subversive weight. A hand held too long, a private nickname, a meaningful glance understood only by two people, all could feel like quiet acts of rebellion. Punishments varied widely. Some abbesses opted for discretion, quietly separating the women and assigning different duties. Others imposed harsh fasting, isolation, or public penance. A few rare cases escalated to ecclesiastical courts, where records rely on careful, evasive language, avoiding explicit detail while leaving the implication tragically clear. Left unmanaged, this powerful force could ruin noble families, destabilize delicate politics, and severely weaken military discipline. Aphrodisiacs, therefore, represented attempts to tame this disruptive emotional force, to guide it toward socially acceptable or, at the very least, survivable outcomes. While some ingredients undoubtedly possessed real physiological effects, others relied exclusively on the power of belief. Most substances, however, sat uncomfortably in the middle. The dividing line between medicine, magic, and outright manipulation remained exceptionally thin because ancient thought refused to compartmentalize them as rigidly as modern culture insists upon. The body and the mind were viewed as inseparable entities, where expectation profoundly shaped the lived experience. There is also an uncomfortable truth beneath the veneer of romance. A significant number of ancient aphrodisiacs were strategically designed not to enhance mutual, reciprocal desire, but instead to ruthlessly override hesitation and resistance. Ancient love culture frequently prioritized the desired outcome above ethical considerations. Attraction was seen as something to be actively produced or compelled, rather than respectfully negotiated. This utilitarian mindset dictated the specific ingredients chosen and the coercive methods employed. And yet, for all their inherent danger and manipulative potential, aphrodisiacs also speak eloquently to human vulnerability. They expose people desperately afraid of being unwanted, of aging, of being ignored, or of losing power. They illustrate deep longing dressed up as codified ritual, and profound fear thinly disguised as confident action. Behind every secretive potion was fundamentally someone hoping, above all else, not to be rejected. In the final analysis, ancient aphrodisiacs never guaranteed love. They guaranteed belief. The belief that desire could be influenced. The belief that personal action mattered. The church generally preferred correction over spectacle, especially when no men were involved and the potential scandal could be contained within the walls. What makes these relationships striking is not their rarity, but their inherent predictability. Remove men, forbid marriage, enforce silence, and demand lifelong celibacy, and affection does not simply perish. It adapts. Medieval convents failed to eliminate desire. They merely redirected it inward, generating bonds so powerful the church itself worried they might supersede devotion to God. If stone walls could be breached, paper slipped through them even more easily. Letters were the quiet bloodstream of convent life, officially tolerated and meticulously regulated, yet endlessly subverted. Nuns were permitted to write to family, patrons, and church officials, but correspondence demanded approval, supervision, and perfect spiritual innocence. What the rules sanctioned and what transpired in reality were two vastly different things. Some letters seemed harmless at a superficial glance. Polite greetings, health updates, or promises of prayers in return for donations. But beneath the surface of respectful language, writers learned to embed layers of emotional meaning. Phrases expressing longing for spiritual guidance, gratitude for past kindness, or concern for a correspondent soul could easily double as emotional confession. Medieval readers were trained in indirect communication, and nuns became exceptionally skilled at this art. When passion could not be named, it learned how to whisper. Surviving letters reveal language that feels uncomfortably intimate. Writers spoke of aching hearts, unbearable absence, sleepless nights, and profound joy at the thought of reunion. Some promised eternal remembrance. Others pleaded for replies with an urgency that transcended mere polite correspondence. Church authorities noticed. The belief that love, however terrifying and uncontrollable, could ultimately be nudged and shaped. That singular, powerful belief was robust enough to endure across centuries. Bishops frequently complained that letters originating from convents sounded more like love poetry than genuine spiritual reflection, and warned confessors to monitor them closely. Smuggling letters was rarely difficult. Messengers, servants, visiting priests, and even sympathetic family members served as essential, discreet couriers. In some documented cases, letters were hidden in food baskets or carefully sewn into clothing hems. A few convents developed sophisticated informal networks where trusted individuals ensured messages traveled safely in both directions. Once this writing began, it often escalated. Letters invited replies, replies encouraged meetings, and meetings swiftly transformed rumor into undeniable risk. When discovered, these letters were damning evidence. Unlike fleeting glances or quiet whispers, they could be read aloud, copied, and preserved. Abbesses were instructed to confiscate any suspicious correspondence and report it to superiors. Some letters were immediately burned to prevent scandal. Others survived precisely because they were seized and filed as proof of wrongdoing. Ironically, the very effort to suppress them ensured their survival for historians. Punishments varied again. Writers might be confined, forced into silence, or transferred to stricter houses. In more serious instances, entire convents fell under suspicion, leading to devastating inspections and reforms. Letters exposed not just individual desire, but institutional vulnerability. They demonstrated that enclosure was never truly absolute and that emotional bonds could stretch far beyond the walls intended to contain them. In the end, these letters remind us that medieval nuns were not silent, passive figures frozen in prayer. They were articulate, literate women who expertly utilized the tools available to them. Ink became their quiet rebellion, carrying forbidden affection where footsteps could not go. If letters slipped quietly through convent walls, confessors walked straight through the front door with the full, explicit approval of the church. Priests were an essential component of convent life. They heard confessions, celebrated mass, delivered sermons, and provided spiritual counsel. In theory, they were neutral, divine instruments of God. In reality, they were human men placed in positions of extraordinary emotional authority over women who had been meticulously trained to obey. Confession was intended to purify the soul, yet it also dangerously created intimacy. A nun spoke alone, often behind a screen, revealing her deepest fears, doubts, and temptations to a man sworn to secrecy. Over time, some confessors ceased being mere spiritual advisors. They became confidants, essential emotional anchors, and, in certain cases, undeniable objects of affection. Church writers warned repeatedly that private confession cultivated dangerous familiarity, especially when conducted too frequently or without proper supervision. The danger, critically, worked both ways. Some priests ruthlessly abused their authority, manipulating devotion into complete dependence. They might frame affection as spiritual guidance or even claim that special bonds were direct signs of divine favor. Others convinced nuns that unwavering obedience to them was synonymous with obedience to God himself. Medieval church records are filled with uncomfortable, carefully chosen phrases like excessive familiarity and inappropriate consolation, designed to avoid saying outright what everyone understood. Not every case involved coercion. Some relationships developed slowly, shaped by shared belief, deep conversation, and persistent emotional vulnerability. A confessor who consistently listened, encouraged, and praised could feel like a literal lifeline in a severely enclosed world. For the priest, admiration from a learned, attentive, and captive audience may have felt equally intoxicating. When boundaries blurred, both sides risked total ruin. The church responded with rules that essentially read like institutional damage control. Confessors were required to be rotated frequently. Some convents mandated the presence of 2 nuns during spiritual discussions. Others strictly limited how often a priest could visit or banned private meetings altogether. These measures were not hypothetical theory. They were direct reactions to repeated scandals that stubbornly refused to disappear. When relationships were uncovered, consequences were severe. Priests could be stripped of their office, immediately reassigned, or imprisoned in monasteries. Nuns faced public penance, isolation, or transfer to considerably harsher houses. In extreme cases, entire convents were accused of corruption, triggering inspections that transformed spiritual homes into detailed crime scenes. What made these relationships especially troubling to church authorities was not just the sexual misconduct, but the catastrophic collapse of hierarchy. A confessor crossing boundaries threatened the very structure of obedience upon which convent life depended. The thin line between spiritual guidance and total control proved far easier to cross than the church ever wished to admit. For church officials, rumors of affection could be managed. Letters could be burned, particular friendships broken up, and priests silently reassigned. Children, however, were infinitely harder to explain away. And yet, medieval records make it painfully clear that pregnancies did occur inside convent walls. These incidents were rare, generally carefully concealed, but utterly devastating when discovered. A pregnant nun represented undeniable, living proof that the enclosure had failed. The pressing question was not only how it happened, but how many people must have known about it. Concealment required extensive cooperation. Fellow nuns, servants, midwives, and sometimes even abbesses became silent, complicit participants. Loose habits, restricted movement, and claims of persistent illness bought precious time. In some circumstances, childbirth happened in absolute secrecy at night with trusted helpers sworn to silence. What became of the children depended entirely on immediate circumstances. Some infants were quietly sent away to be raised by relatives, placed with sympathetic families, or simply abandoned at foundling hospitals. Others disappeared from the record entirely, leaving historians to suspect tragic outcomes that were never committed to writing. A few convents developed disturbingly efficient, internal systems for removing all physical evidence before it could ever reach church authorities. When pregnancies were exposed, punishment could be brutal. Nuns were interrogated, often under intense pressure to name accomplices. Fathers, if identified, faced their own penalties, though records consistently show the women bore the heaviest burden of shame and consequence. Some nuns were expelled and publicly disgraced. Others were locked into stricter convents, their lives reduced to silence and permanent isolation. In the most extreme cases, ecclesiastical courts imposed lifelong imprisonment. The church publicly framed these cases as individual moral collapse. But the institutional responses reveal something far more complicated. Authorities were often reluctant to expose the scandal fully. Bishops weighed severe punishment against the risk to the institution's reputation, frequently choosing immediate secrecy when public outrage threatened donations or political support. Quiet resolutions were always preferred. Justice was negotiable. Appearances were not. These hidden children ultimately exposed the profound contradiction at the heart of medieval convent life. Celibacy was rigorously demanded, but meaningful choice was perpetually absent. Surveillance was strict, yet human nature proved more resilient than stone and mortar. The ideal of enclosure was formidable, but never complete. While the blame for infractions routinely fell on individual women, the institutional machinery quietly prioritized self-preservation, adjusting procedures to shield the structure rather than protect its members. The convent wasn't just inadequate. It actively consumed the missteps of its inhabitants, burying their errors and evidence behind thick stone walls intended to divide spiritual purity from the messy reality of the flesh. Yet, life persistently broke through. Evidence of this difficult truth: crying infants, rushed departures, and altered official records, demonstrates a reality the Church continually struggled to manage. While religious vows were mandated, the forces of biology and human emotion proved fundamentally disobedient. Although medieval convents were often idealized as perfectly sealed sanctuaries, inconvenient truths revealed by archaeology and archival documentation tell a different story. Enclosure presented an imposing facade to the external world, but its effectiveness ultimately rested on fragile human discipline, not physical impossibility. Since human nature is inherently flawed, people inevitably engineered practical loopholes into the very stone meant to contain them. Most convents maintained secondary, functional entrances necessary for daily operations. Essential needs, food and supply delivery, waste disposal, maintenance, and emergency medical care, demanded access points separate from the strictly controlled main gate. Gradually, these necessary doors evolved from functional access to routine passages, then became invisible fixtures, and finally were quietly exploited. A back entrance intended for weekly use soon became a fixture no one scrutinized. A key initially reserved for crises transformed into a key held permanently. True, flawless enclosure, therefore, existed primarily in abstract sermons. Furthermore, some convent properties shared common walls with surrounding municipalities. Windows often overlooked busy streets, and roofs sometimes connected directly to adjacent secular buildings. In several documented instances, subterranean passages and tunnels existed beneath the convents, initially constructed for purposes like drainage, storage, or providing an escape route during military sieges. Over time, popular rumors assigned them far more scandalous uses. While we cannot validate every folklore tale of secret passageways, sufficient physical evidence confirms that many convents were substantially more porous than their stringent regulations would suggest. Servants constituted another critical failure point. Unlike the nuns, these staff members were not bound by lifelong cloistering. They moved freely between the religious house and the town, acting as crucial carriers of supplies, messages, and inevitable gossip. Relying on servants was unavoidable, but this reliance simultaneously manufactured opportunity for breach. A discreet or well-paid servant could facilitate forbidden meetings, deliver correspondence, or simply ignore infractions. Silence was a negotiable commodity, and medieval society was highly skilled in managing such informal, often clandestine transactions. Abbesses were usually aware of these vulnerabilities. Some attempted to enforce discipline ruthlessly, sealing secondary doors, frequently rotating staff, and rigorously reporting all suspicions to superiors. Others adopted a strategy of pragmatism, recognizing that overly rigid enforcement risked sparking open rebellion or attracting damaging external scrutiny. A small, controlled leakage of discipline was often preferable to a public explosion. As long as internal scandals remained contained and quiet, institutional order was deemed successfully maintained. When ecclesiastical inspectors announced their arrival, the convents underwent an immediate, dramatic transformation. Questionable doors were hastily bricked shut, often temporarily. Routines were meticulously tightened. Nuns received specific instruction on what details to present and which facts to erase from memory. Inspections were, more often than not, pre-announced, providing ample time for the community to orchestrate its performance. This preparation was less about deliberate corruption and more about instinctive institutional survival. The crucial myth of perfect enclosure had to be preserved because it directly underpinned church authority. If the convent walls were genuinely impregnable, any discovered scandal could be safely attributed to a nun's individual moral failing. To admit structural weaknesses would be to admit the entire monastic system was fundamentally impractical. Therefore, the Church maintained the facade of sealed holiness, even while doors continued to open and close silently behind that facade. Stone walls might deter unauthorized footsteps, but they possess no power against human intent. Medieval convents were seldom breached by Hollywood-style escapes or audacious acts by daring lovers. Instead, their defenses crumbled due to minor, repeated compromises until the concept of enclosure devolved from a physical reality into a mere institutional ideal. When unauthorized relationships inevitably surfaced, the Church confronted a significant institutional dilemma. While public punishment could successfully reinforce moral authority, the resulting public scandal risked damaging reputations, reducing crucial donations, and undermining political alliances. The resulting solution was typically a form of selective justice. Discipline harsh enough to instill deterrence, yet quiet enough to maintain containment. Medieval religious discipline was fundamentally geared toward control, not fairness. Minor infractions were routinely managed through internal means. A nun suspected of inappropriate closeness might face reassignment, forced isolation, or be subjected to arduous fasting and additional prayers. Forced silence was a favored and devastating disciplinary tool. Being prohibited from speaking, singing, or participating in the rich fabric of communal life could be imposed for months or even years. In a religious environment structured entirely around shared ritual and worship, this imposition of silence was never a mild correction. It was a form of social and spiritual erasure. Grave offenses escalated into formal ecclesiastical court proceedings, which were intentionally designed to be opaque. Official records deliberately employed vague terminology, referring to grave misconduct or violation of chastity, to avoid documenting explicit details. The overriding objective was not the pursuit of truth but the swift restoration of institutional order. Confessions were often extracted under duress, penances assigned, and the incriminating documentation immediately sealed away. Justice, much like the original transgressions, was administered and finalized behind closed doors. Social status profoundly influenced the outcome. A well-endowed convent supported by powerful noble patrons typically received significantly more lenient treatment than a struggling rural house. Influential families possessed the leverage to intervene, securing internal transfers for their daughters rather than outright expulsions. Abbesses belonging to powerful lineages could negotiate directly with local bishops. Conversely, lower-status nuns faced harsher outcomes, often becoming expedient public examples of moral failure. Men implicated in these relationships were handled differently. Priests and male clergy might be reassigned, discreetly disciplined, or relocated to another monastery. Public disgrace for them was a rarity unless the entire scandal had already become widely known. It was the women who bore the majority of the visible consequences. Their bodies offered physical evidence. Their reputations were politically simpler to sacrifice. This stark imbalance was neither accidental nor concealed. The culture of silence extended far beyond the immediate punishment. Witnesses were actively discouraged from testifying, incriminating letters were destroyed, resulting children were removed, and collective memory was aggressively managed. The objective was not merely to halt the behavior, but to surgically eliminate the entire narrative. A scandal successfully forgotten was, by definition, a scandal resolved. Paradoxically, this rigid culture of silence guaranteed that repetition was likely. Without candid acknowledgement, the cyclical patterns of transgression went unexamined. Reforms consistently targeted symptoms instead of root causes. Rules became more numerous, surveillance intensified, yet the deep-seated human and structural pressures remained unaltered. Discipline within medieval convents was ultimately focused less on absolute morality and more on institutional maintenance. The Church did not require perfect purity. It required plausible purity. As long as the physical walls maintained their appearance of integrity and the dissenters remained quiet, the system could reliably persist. Those who dared to break that imposed silence paid the ultimate price, not solely for their personal actions, but for the fundamental threat their exposure posed to the entire prevailing narrative. Every significant scandal inevitably triggered a wave of reform. New regulations were rapidly codified, inspections became more rigorous, and pulpits thundered with sermons denouncing moral decay and demanding discipline. To the external observer, this appeared to be decisive action. But for those inside the convent, it was simply déjà vu. Reform efforts failed to eradicate human desire. They merely compelled it to become more cunning. The church consistently attempted to physically tighten enclosure. Grills were reinforced, windows were screened, visiting hours were curtailed, and confessors were rotated with greater frequency. Yet, every single reform laid bare the same uncomfortable reality. The system's effectiveness hinged entirely on relentless vigilance, and relentless vigilance is fundamentally unsustainable. Human fatigue proved to be a far more reliable force than divine regulation. Some monastic houses completely disintegrated under the weight of scandal. When accusations multiplied or the evidence became politically impossible to conceal, entire convents were dissolved. Nuns were dispersed to other institutions, and their community was formally erased as though it had never been established. Official explanations invariably cited corruption or spiritual frailty, never acknowledging structural failure. Blame was thus safely maintained at the individual level. Other scandals managed to escape the walls and seep into the popular imagination. Ballads, pervasive rumors, and satirical literature circulated widely, detailing lustful nuns, clandestine lovers, and forbidden nocturnal gatherings. Though often sensationalized, the persistence of these tales was significant. They demonstrated a broad public realization that convents were not the sealed sanctuaries the church proclaimed. The common people knew, the clergy knew, and yet everyone publicly maintained the pretense. Ironically, these very stories hardened societal expectations. Nuns were increasingly viewed with suspicion, and the justification for ever stricter rules relied on the assumption that temptation was pervasive. Women, regardless of individual virtue, paid the price for a collective reputation they did not earn. Innocence became an irrelevant consideration. Trust was completely supplanted by surveillance. While some internal church reformers occasionally identified deeper systemic issues, arguing that forced vocations were the core problem or questioning lifelong vows imposed on adolescents, these voices seldom prevailed. Convents continued to function primarily as convenient tools for managing family politics, inheritance, and the general social order. The institution endured because it was politically useful, not because it was humane. By the late Middle Ages, these structural cracks were undeniable. Calls for fundamental change resonated outside the convent, providing fuel for broader critiques of ecclesiastical authority. When the Reformation finally erupted, convent scandals were eagerly weaponized, serving as highly potent proof of systemic hypocrisy. Tales once confined to whispers became public ammunition. Reform efforts ultimately failed because they sought to address behavior without ever considering the issue of consent. They fundamentally misdiagnosed desire as simple disobedience rather than human inevitability. Medieval convents were not uniquely corrupt environments. They were meticulously designed pressure chambers constructed to suppress fundamental human needs without offering any outlet. Scandal did not lead to the instantaneous destruction of these institutions, but it progressively weakened the necessary illusion that held them intact. Once that essential illusion cracked, it proved impossible to fully repair. By the close of the Middle Ages, the history of unauthorized relationships within convents became a narrative that could not be fully suppressed. This was not because every convent was morally compromised, but because the gulf between the monastic ideal and the lived reality was finally too glaringly visible. The Church stubbornly maintained that enclosure operated perfectly in principle, despite centuries of contradictory evidence. The physical walls endured, but the protective illusion surrounding them had vanished. What emerges most powerfully from the historical documentation is not the shock of scandal, but the enduring presence of human frailty.